Welcome to Season 3 of the Six Lessons Podcast, Episode 2. We'll be talking about adhesive dentistry. The last episode, we talked about minimally invasive dentistry evolving with adhesive dentistry and the evolution of biomimetic dentistry from adhesive dentistry. It's an important distinction, all three of these concepts. Today, we'll talk about adhesive dentistry because that's something that every dental school teaches. And every dental school has been doing something with adhesive dentistry for 40 years. But the differentiation between adhesive dentistry and biomimetic dentistry is very important. But we'll deal with how adhesive dentistry has evolved. And when I went to dental school in 1975 through 1978, the idea of adhesive dentistry, we did etch enamel, for example, on anterior restorations, but the only composites we had were chemical cure. So we used a chemical cure adhesive underneath the chemical cure composites, and we did etch the enamel. So etching the enamel with phosphoric acid was pioneered in the mid-50s by Michael Bonacore. So from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, when I went to dental school for 20 years, there was really no progress in the idea of bonding to dentin. In fact, when I learned my adhesive dental techniques for anterior composites in dental school at the University of the Pacific, we were very careful to cover the dentin with Dical. And that was under the misinformation, the misguided idea that etching the odontoblastic tubule processes with etch would damage them. That is not true. It was a dogma that was developed just with some theories that had no real scientific basis or confirmation. But you do what you learn in dental school, and I would cover the dentin with Dical, and then I would etch the enamel with phosphoric acid, and then rinse, dry, and place our dual cure bonding system, and then we would do the bulk fill with the dual cure composite. And for anterior class 3 restorations, we had some success, but the important thing to understand the difference between adhesive dentistry success in the anterior and adhesive dentistry disasters in the posterior is that the forces of occlusion are 10 times in the back of the mouth as they are in the front of the mouth. I never learned that in dental school. The research on it actually came in the 80s out of the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. Gibbs and other researchers published the bite forces and studied the bite forces of different patients. And we find out that there's a huge variety in forces of occlusion. A maximum bite force might vary from 55 pounds to a very slight, low functioning or low stressful occlusal system. 55 pounds is the lowest measured maximum bite force. The highest measured maximum bite force in the humans that were studied in Florida was 950 pounds. I mean, that's like 20 times stronger. And so that kind of masticatory system can break natural teeth. It can bend gold. It can do all kinds of things. I've seen these things happen in the patients that I've had in the last 44 years. And then some patients, the bite force is so small that you can restore them with a temporary material like IRM, and it can last for decades. And that's part of the analysis of what we call stress of occlusion in lesson 6, but it also impacts the idea of how things crack and break and start to fail in lesson 2. Well, all of these things, obviously, I knew nothing of this as I graduated from dental school and practiced in the Navy for 3 years. We had success doing bonded composites on the anterior, but we did not even were allowed to use composites on the posterior. When I got into private practice in 1981, I was in Salt Lake City, Utah, and we did our normal amalgam fillings and crowns in the back, root canals when the patients had continued sensitivity, and then full coverage, of course, on everything that had some fractured cusp, for example, even though we didn't even think to know that the cusp fracture could happen progressively, and we were creating stress and fractures in our amalgam preparations. This was pioneered in the 80s by Mondelli in Brazil and with Larson and Douglas in Minnesota. So in the 80s, after I graduated from dental school, people started to think, why are these teeth breaking? Could we do something about them? And the answer was, yeah, full coverage, full coverage, full coverage. But the full coverage, there's many different types of minimally invasive concepts in a gold onlay or a very conservative gold veneer crown. There's all types of ways to approach dentistry. But as a young dentist, all I knew is that I would see these cases come down from Idaho. We used to call them Idaho cases. These progressive amalgam replacing dentists were putting composites in their back teeth, and all of them were failing. They were all sensitive and they were fracturing. And not only did the composite fracture, the teeth were still fracturing like amalgams. So the idea of any type of superiority of adhesive restoration in the back was totally frowned upon by a traditional dentist like myself, who saw the failures of these early posterior composites. But, I wasn't smart enough at that time to figure out that composites in the front were good, composites in the back were bad. I really didn't come across occlusal forces until 1995 and 1996, 1997, when I started to come into contact with my first mentor, Ray Bertolotti, a second mentor, John Coyce. Took occlusion courses from him in 98, and he actually introduced me to the Larson paper of 81. But the Larson paper of 81 had a lot of information that, in my view, did not recommend full coverage as your first approach, because by 1998, when I was studying with John Coyce, I had been mentored not only by Ray Bertolotti since 1995, but I had some contact that year at the ADA convention in San Francisco with Gary Unterbrink. And Gary Unterbrink introduced me to concepts that made me feel like posterior adhesive restorations were not being done properly. And that's basically from 98 till now has been my mission, to figure out how adhesive dentistry could be successful in the posterior without full coverage. And we discovered that after 7 years, but the continued problem with posterior teeth being restored with composite by only using adhesive dentistry continues to plague the profession, because there's not an understanding of how these composites move and shrink. And so what's missing in adhesive dentistry is the concept of polymerization dynamics. And what that means, when these composites are coming together, they're moving, and that movement has consequences for the edges of these restorations. Now, every dentist will say they understand that composite shrinks. But then when I ask specific questions on how does that impact your clinical practice, they can't give a cohesive answer, because it hugely impacts your restoration, because your bond in dentin is destroyed because it's not decoupled or separated from the bond to enamel. So adhesive dentistry concentrates on the bond to enamel. They depend on the bond to enamel. Biomimetic dentistry is just the opposite. They depend on the bond to dentin. And a bond to enamel is nice. We use adhesive principles in the 6 lessons approach. When we bond to enamel, we do the same etching, we do the same adhesive, we do the same. Even a bulk fill on enamel will not be destructive if the foundational, what we call the biobase, is in place. But none of these concepts, obviously, that we invented, that we had to synthesize from the literature, were available throughout the 80s and into the early 90s. And so the adhesive dentistry that's taught in school will be very comfortable teaching a veneer prep, for example. And most veneer preps are mostly bonding to enamel, and they will have success. But how about a veneer that has erosion, and all of a sudden the enamel is missing, but the dentin is the higher percentage of your bondable tooth structure? What are the concepts that need to be used to differentiate that type of veneer prep from a veneer prep in enamel? I've done thousands of veneer preps over my career. I've had no debonds. I remember Davey and I went to a new group of dentists in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we found out that they were having veneers debond. as soon as we heard that, Davey and I looked at each other like, these guys aren't ready to go to a biomimetic approach. They don't even know what adhesive dentistry is and how to make it work. And part of their problem, they were using simplified adhesive systems from 3M, and they were bad adhesive systems. And they had debonds of veneers because veneers do have stress. And if the veneer is not diagnosed as having a different level of the hierarchy of bondability from enamel to dentin, then that hierarchy of bondability, even in a veneer cementation, can have negative effects. And the veneer's adhesive bond through the hybrid layer can peel off, and a debonded veneer is possible, although I've never had that. My mentor, Ray Bertolotti, did in his career 14,000 veneers, never had a debond. Why? Because he did understand that if he had dentin as part of the veneer preparation, then he would treat that dentin separately. When he taught that to me, he did not call it immediate dentin sealing. He just taught that in the first course that I attended in 1995. And in 1995, the bonding systems were just developing. I have a list here of 23 bonding systems that were available in 1995. Of those 23 bonding systems, only Allbond 2, Optibond FL, and Clearfill liner bond system, which devolved into the Clearfill systems. But only 3 out of those bonding systems that were available in 1995 are still available now. Why? Evolution says the survival of the fittest means that if you don't have a good product, you're going to die, you're not going to survive. And, the free market has the ability to control people to make choices and change products. And this is what's happened. There are many new bonding systems that have been developed over the last 30 years that are still viable options for adhesive dentistry. But when we came to this idea of bonding to dentin, Ray Bertolotti would always say the best bonding systems available right now is called Allbond 2. Not Allbond 1, but Allbond 2. And it was a 3-step, total etch, acetone-based bonding system from this company called Bisco, still alive and selling Allbond 3 now, which is a bonding system that Simone Della Peri has used successfully for over 20 years. So Bisco, Allbond 3, at that time, Allbond 2 was the best. And so Ray Bertolotti would show you how to bond the exposed dentin. And then when the Courare products became more dependable, then he would teach. And at that point, the Courare product that I had was a 2-bottle system, which was called Photobond, had a very thin film thickness, which is a disadvantage. It wasn't as good. Ray knew that that was something that needed to change. That's a long story there, but the idea is that treating dentin with a different bonding system than you treat enamel, that was introduced to me in 1995 by Ray Bertolotti. But the next concept that Ray Bertolotti introduced to me actually 2 years later, 1997 in Yosemite, a course that I took from Ray, introduced a new bonding system called Liner Bond 2. And Liner Bond 2 was a break. It was first in Japan in 1989, started to come to the United States in the mid-90s. And by that time, it had the same or even a superior position than the Allbond 2. So in 1997, I learned adhesive dentistry, veneer preps, veneer bonding systems from Ray Bertolotti, and a new system, which was improved and probably the same as Allbond 2. And that was Liner Bond 2, not Liner Bond 1, which actually had a good system. We've talked about that in the podcast. But all of these ideas of improvements in materials, and that changes your approach to techniques, or techniques demand different materials. These are all concepts that were being discussed at advanced adhesive seminars around the world. But then the next year, 1998, again at a lecture in Yosemite, or this lecture might have been in Las Vegas at the ADA convention. That would have been 99. Anyway, all the dates, they kind of come together and leave in your mind. But in 1997, Ray Bertolotti introduced a concept that was being talked about, had been talked about for 10 years. It had more papers published about it. It was called C-factor. And that was the ratio of bonded to unbonded surfaces. And so for 2 years, I was doing adhesive dentistry, never heard the concept of C-factor, never heard about it when he did it. He gave me a reference. I started to do a literature review on those references. We had the journal Operative Dentistry was available to me at Ultradent, had a library at that time, and I researched the original papers from 1984, 1987 from Carol Davidson, and all of a sudden C-factor was very important because it had to do with this stress to the hybrid layer. Now, in those days, the bonding systems that we had, that were investigated in the mid-'80s, were part of this group, but the systems that were used were not the 3 systems that survived. In 1980s, the systems that were tested were very early testing that on a flat surface, these bond systems could only get about 19 megapascals. Now, the bonding systems we have now on flat surfaces can get 50, even 60 megapascals, triple that amount. But these early testing of the bonds on these flat surfaces, all of a sudden, when they started to incorporate a cavity, which is like a tooth normal situation, a class 1 or class 5, Carol Davidson and his team found out that about 19 megapascals, you could not keep your bond in a 3 or 4 walled cavity configuration, or the C factor of 3 or above was too much to keep that bond strength if it started at a 19 potential on a flat surface. Well, as time goes on, and this is the 80s, and now I'm in the 90s studying, and we're proving bonding systems. And now, 5 years after I started adhesive dentistry, I came to be mentored through the literature by doctors out of Japan who had now shown that these systems are having double the bond strength of traditional adhesive systems. And so in 2000, the theoretical concept that came out of Tokyo Medical and Dental University is that these adhesives now have such improvements and they're near the strength of the DEJ in a natural tooth. Again, this is on flat surfaces, so they're not theoretically into C-factor at this time. In fact, they were kind of resisting it. The Japanese had the idea, build a strong enough bonding system, then you don't have to worry about these confusing ideas of the ratio of bonded to unbonded surfaces. I can see that. Dentists want easy. Dentists aren't smart. Is that what we're saying? I had a science background. I had a chemistry minor. I had a microbiology major. I was not afraid of science. I just went to dental school thinking there's not much science here. There's a lot of hand and eye coordination. You have to be able to do things. It's more like a sculpture class than anything scientific. But now, I'm out of dental school almost 20 years, 17 years. I quit dentistry out of frustration of the traditional mechanical approaches and the early adhesive approaches in the 80s that I tried products, promised by 3M that these are great systems, and they were not great systems. They were not good. I just wasted money, for basically 10 years. But with the improvement of materials and the improvement of understanding the science, then all of a sudden it came to me that there was the ability to start using composites in the posterior. And my second serious mentor in adhesive dentistry, Gary Unterbrink, had some techniques that he taught me and some techniques that he didn't teach that were inspirational to me to try to find out the answers, which I did. But as I talked to Gary Unterbrink in 1998, 1999, 2000, then these ideas of polymerization dynamics being the key to understanding how to keep the hybrid layer from being stretched in dentin. That's an important concept you've never heard before unless you've been taught by me. Nobody's ever talked about a hybrid lane being stretched during its polymerization phase. But when I understood that that was what caused weakening of the dentin hybrid layer before it failed, then preventing the stretching of the hybrid layer during the polymerization reaction became key to maintaining its strength and for having the longest sustainability, the longevity of this restoration. And then in 2002, I would say maybe one of the top 10 of all time dental papers was published out of a combined effort from Germany, Japan, and the United States. My third mentor in adhesive dentistry, Charlie Cox was part of that team, and in 2002, they published this paper that compared C-factor, hybrid strength, and bonding systems direct versus indirect. And the lead author was Toru Nikaido, a friend of mine, one of the first PhD students under Tagami. And Toru Nikaido, when he published his paper, I've thanked him personally for the effort he did. It was a team effort. Dr. Kunzelman from Germany, Charlie Cox from the United States, I think Dr. Watts from England was on that paper also. But they found out that with C-factor, you do a direct composite with a 2 millimeter or even a bulk fill technique, you're going to lose half of the bond strength. In other words, if you have a potential of 50 or 60, you're going to be down into the 20s. And that was just right off the bat. But then what they did in this test is that after they tested the bond strength, then they had another group of samples that were restored the same way. And then they put them in a chewing machine. And this chewing machine with thermocycling and actual forces of chewing came up with these stretched hybrid layers, these weakened hybrid layers that lost 50% of its bond strength, within the first year for sure. Under function would lose another 10% of their bond strength. And then they had the other group that they tested, that they allowed the immediate dentin sealing and resin coating before an indirect restoration was placed. They let it mature, and when it matured, and then they placed the indirect restoration and pulled that apart, then it doubled the bond strength. It got into the 40s. But the great thing was they had this other group of these immediate dentin sealing, resin coating, indirect onlay or inlay restorations. Then this group, they fatigued. Now, the group that was done without this stress control, that lost half of its bond strength immediately, and then under fatigue lost another 10%. The group here not only had a double bond strength immediately with this approach, but under chewing fatigue of 10,000 cycles, they tested the bond strength. It had no decrease in bond strength. That's hugely important. So if you don't stretch the hybrid layer in the first 24 hours, then you have the ability to have a hybrid layer that is now as strong as a natural tooth without fatigue. A natural tooth doesn't fatigue unless it has some type of crack into the dentin. Okay, so 2002, Nikaido published the paper. Of course, I go to dental conventions, talk to dentists. I go to meetings, I talk to dentists. I talk to my friends. I talk to my friends. Nobody knows any of this stuff. I've been studying it for 7 years. I've got it figured out. I've basically been doing the 6 lessons approach for 3 years in my office from 99 when a gold standard bonding system was introduced in the United States market called SE bond. Information about deactivating MMPs came out a couple years later. Anyway, we put it all together, and all of a sudden, you restore a tooth, no sensitivity. You restore a tooth, 5 years, it's still fine. 10 years, still fine. Now 15, 20, now 25 years, we're going into restoration that are just fine. In other words, they're acting like a tooth. They're connected side to side, front to back, top to bottom, with the same connection that a natural tooth has, which is someplace within 30 to 50 megapascal. Sounds easy, but you have to learn it, and we are going to invite all of you to learn that, and many opportunities are around the world. You can come to Provo, get trained. You can go online, get trained in our mastership, which is really our flagship. We want you to have the same success that these hundreds, even thousands of dentists are having now using the 6 lessons approach to biomimetic dentistry. And so until next time, get bonded, stay bonded.